Well, hello, everybody. I'm Melissa Miller, and I am an application security advocate here at Sneak. And we are all set for our next speaker. We're going to jump over now from JavaScript and we're going to hop into the security track. And so our first speaker comes to us from Auth0. Her name is Anna Sidre, and she's here today. She's going to tell us all about web components and how we can leverage them for authentication in our applications. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Anna.
Welcome to my talk about web components for authentication, the what, the why, and the how. Just before I dive into my talk, let me introduce myself a little bit. So I'm Anna Sidri, and I'm a developer advocate for Auth0. Auth0 is a flexible drop-in solution to add authentication and authorization services to your applications. So if you have any questions about Auth0, about implementation, about this talk, or just want to say hi, feel free to reach out on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @AnnaCidri_. Outside of work, I'm pretty active with the community. So I organize several events and meetups. One of those is NG Spain. It's an Angular conference in Spain, but because of the current situation this year, we don't have a conference. But hopefully next year we'll be able to run one again. And I'm very passionate about women in tech, therefore I help a lot in this sector, and I organize events locally with my Girls Tech group, and also on a more international scale with the Google initiative Women Tech Makers. So that's enough about me. Let's get started. And like I said, this talk is about web components for authentication. So I think a good starting point is to ask ourselves, what is a web component? So a web component is a component that is completely platform agnostic. This allows us to have maximum interoperability because we'll be able to share it across teams and we can use it as many times as we need to. Another cool thing about web components is that they allow us to be encapsulated, right? So this prevents any styling or behavioral leakages in or out. When we think about web components, we tend to think about dumb components, but that is totally not true, and we're going to see later on in this talk that we can also create smart components with them. So what do these web components actually consist of? Well, they consist of three main technologies: HTML template, custom elements, and Shadow DOM. HTML template is just a HTML tag called template in which we place the template of our web component. And then with custom elements, what we do is actually create the HTML tag, or we can extend or improve an already existing one. But we do have to be careful when we're creating a HTML tag with the naming. Like best practices in all languages, we should probably keep the naming understandable so we know what we're dealing with. And also when we're writing our code, we want to know for our future selves and for other people what this component actually does, right? Also, when you're naming, you have to remember to add a dash. So it has to be web-component, for example. And last but not least, Shadow DOM. So Shadow DOM is what's going to allow us to have that encapsulation that I was talking about there earlier. Okay, so to get a better understanding of what a web component is, we will start by building a DOM component. And what we're going to build is a simple login button, which we can style from the outside. So let's dive right in. First of all, what we're doing is we're creating our template tag here. And we have a simple button with an ID, login button, which we'll later style. Then we are creating our custom element, and we are extending HTML element because it allows us to inherit all of the features of this HTML element, obviously, and also it will be recognized as a DOM element. Then we're calling our constructor, and in there we have super, so we have access to all of the APIs. Next, what we need to do is add our Shadow DOM in here. And this is a very simple process. All we need to do is add 2 lines of codes. So we're attaching the shadow and we're calling mode open. We call mode open because we want to give the possibility to the users to manipulate the structure of the component via JavaScript. Now, if you didn't want to do this, you could put closed here, where my cursor is. And this, in general, I wouldn't recommend closing it, because even though you have intentions for your web component to be a certain way, developers might want to use them in different ways and have different structures. So in general, I would advise to keep it open. And then what we're doing is we're just cloning our template, and instead of adding it to the DOM, we're adding it to the shadow DOM. Cool. And last but not least, we need to define our custom element. And remember how I said that we should give it a name that's legible? Well, in this case, we're going to call it login-button. And then we just call the property login button element. So we're basically done. But right at the beginning, when we created the template, I didn't show you how we could style it. Now, I want to just pause here on the styling a bit, because it's a very, very important aspect. When we create a web component, people will be using it and implementing it into their own applications. So we need to think about use cases as how they're going to be styling these. They should have the possibility to style them accordingly to their application, whether it's because of corporate identity design or whether it's just personal preferences. I think styling is something that really needs to be thought about. So there's two ways to go about styling. The first is called CSS custom properties. And this is the preferred way just because the browsers are almost fully stable. So what we do here is we, to allow CSS custom properties, we call CSS variables on our CSS properties. So you can see within our login button, we have a background color, and then on the background color property, we're calling bar, and then within the parentheses, we give it a variable name and a default color. And then the user from the outside, what they can do is then style the web component through the style attribute, the HTML style attribute, and they are calling the variable name and then the color of their choice. That way they can change the background color to fit their application. And this can go for as many variables as you want to. But as you can imagine, this can tend to be a bit buggy because you can always have a typo. Also, it's a bit tedious because you have to add so many different variables there in the style attribute. So there is another way to go about this, and it's called CSS shadow parts with the parts pseudo class. I'm going to briefly go over it, but if you do want to have a better understanding of this, I really recommend that you check out the article that you see there below, that source, because this is an article by Monica from the Polymer team, and she explains it really in depth and really well. One problem with CSS shadow parts is that the browsers aren't stable. I know Safari is working on it, so that will hopefully turn green soon. But you can see that CSS custom properties are a lot more stable. So the cool thing about the CSS parts pseudo class is that we can allow developers to we can decide what parts of our web component developers can style. Now, I know in a button there aren't very many different parts, but say, for example, in a form or in a card, you might have separate sections and you might want the users to just style, for example, a div or an input. However, you don't want them to style a different div for whatever reason. Now you can give them access through the part attribute and then give it a name. And then the user, when they decide that they want to style their component, all they have to do is in their CSS, add the web component name, use the part pseudo class, and then give it a name. And then they can just change whatever properties they want to. So it's a lot nicer, a lot neater, it's a lot more readable, and it's also a lot easier. So how would we implement it into our button? Well, we can, and all we need to do is call the part here, and then the user would call the web component, which is the login button, the part pseudo class, and then the name of the part, which is custom button. Right, and that's how we create a login button, and we create that style attribute in which people can style however they want to. So now that we have a basic understanding of what web components are, let's move on to authentication. So what is authentication? Authentication is the process of confirming an identity. It's when a user or an application proves that they say who they say they are by providing valid credentials, which tend to be a username or a password. However, there are many factors we can use to validate these credentials. And if you have more than one process, one-factor authentication, say you have two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, this is going to make your application more secure. And these factors tend to rely on, they fall into like three categories, which are what you know, what you have, or what you are. Now, authentication and authorization tend to be used interchangeably. However, they are very different. So whereas authentication is the process of validating a user, well, authorization is the process of verifying what a user has access to. So in authorization, a user or an application is granted access to an API, and after the API determines what extent, like what permissions it should assign to that user. So this is the part that comes after authentication. And yes, it's true that access to a resource is protected by both authentication and authorization. However, for this talk, we are just going to focus on authentication. So now we've got a basic understanding of what a web component is, what authentication is. How can a web component-based ecosystem help when approaching authentication? Well, I'm going to talk to you about several things that I think where I think web components can help. And we will start with maximum interoperability, which is something that I talked about at the very beginning of the talk. Now let's put a use case. Say like, for example, there is a big company and there are several products within the company. And each product has their own team, and each team uses a different framework. Maybe one team uses Angular, another team uses Vue, and last but not least, we have a team that uses Polymer. Now, they all need this login process, and it has to have the same feel, even though the design isn't necessarily the same because different products can have different designs. The user experience should more or less be the same because it is the same company. So how could we go about this? Well, instead of having each team to build the same login process, like 3 times in this case, we could create one web component and then share it across teams, or however many web components we may need for this login process, but then share it across teams, and we're not starting from scratch every single time. So this will save a lot of time and a lot of headaches. Now, if you want to know if your framework, the framework you're working with, allows you to use web components, well, I would go check out this website, Custom Elements Everywhere, by Rob Dodson, who's on the Polymer team. He created this to show you how web component-friendly frameworks are. Next, web components are very, very easy to implement. Now, normally when we have to do some sort of implementation, it comes with a very long and tedious way of doing so. So we have to copy code, we have to paste it, we have to change, we have to do this, we have to do that. And sometimes things don't go as planned, and we have to look for another way of doing it, and it can cause a lot of time and headaches, like I said before. So with web components, all we need to do is use the code that's on the right, the login button, for example, and then we do an npm install. We have to also add the attributes, obviously, and then you save it, and that's it. You're good to go. So it's a pretty simple process. Another cool thing is that we can have as much flexibility as we want, whether it's through the HTML attributes. Oops, sorry, went a bit fast. Here we have the domain and the client ID attributes. However, you can add or remove whichever ones you want, and gives the user as much flexibility as you want to. So that's pretty cool. And talking about flexibility, we've already talked about styling. I'm just going to mention the 2 stylings that we have, but again, the user can design and change the web component however they want to, because there's CSS custom properties, and CSS shadow files. And last but not least, we have slots. So slots act like a placeholder in which the user can then decide whether they want to actually add a piece of HTML within their web component or not. Let's see what I'm talking about here. So as you can see, we have two buttons, a login one, a logout, and then we have a slot, which might be, for example, to allow the user to add a description if they want to, or a name, or a role, or whatever they may want to here. When you're dealing with slots, it's important and always good practice to add a name, because if you have more than one slot, then the DOM needs to know which slot you're talking about and where to add it, basically. So remember to always name your slots, even if you just have the one. And then the user would then, through the auth element, after adding the attributes, whatever, it can just add a div, for example, and then add the slot and the name of the slot, and then whatever they need to there. So that's a pretty cool feature. Next, web components we could create to make authentication simple. Now, here are a few ideas that I have to make this authentication process a bit more simple through just using web components. One of them could be a login screen, and we have social buttons here. It's just an idea. It could be maybe the name of the logged in user, and then maybe when the name is clicked or the image is clicked, it takes the user to the profile, or maybe we want to add the user's roles here, or it really depends on what you're looking for. And then this is what we're going to be building in just a second. It's a web component that is a login button, which we've already seen. However, it's going to deal with the whole authentication process. And to do so, we're going to use Auth0. Now, remember how I said at the beginning, we were building a DOM component? Well, we built this DOM component, it had no logic to it. So let's make that DOM component smart. Now, to make the DOM component smart, I have used an Auth0 SDK to help me. So let's see what I did. First of all, I installed the Auth0 SDK, Spark.js, because for this example, we will be using Vanilla.js. Later on, I'll show you other options we can use to build web components, but just for simplicity of the talk, I have built it with Vanilla.js. Then we're going to import it, like you see here. And then where we created our login button element previously, we're going to add the domain and client ID properties, which are going to be the attributes that we are going to allow the user to add. So here we keep them empty because this is what we want to allow the users to add, the information we want to add. And then we have some getters and setters. So we have these on both the domain and the client ID. And as you can see, I have a build Auth0 client method there at the bottom. And this is so that because we need to rebuild the Auth0 client whenever the values of the domain or the client ID properties change. So we need to invoke this method and we need to do it last. We then have the getObserved attributes. So the getObserved attributes is a static property that returns an array, as you can see, and it has the names of the component's attributes, which in this case are domain and client ID. The property is asking the browser to be notified when the value of any of these attributes change. And then you can capture these notifications from the browser by implementing the attribute change callback. Now, the attribute change callback is a custom element reaction, and you can implement it to handle some events in the lifecycle of the component. And what we're doing here is what I just said previously. We're just capturing the notifications from the browser. Next, we have a connected callback. So this connected callback is also a custom element reaction, and it's called when the component is added to the page's DOM. Now here what we're doing is we're creating an instance of the Auth0 client. We're adding in a listener for the click event, which we'll go into this in just a second. We're then managing the result of the authentication and updating the UI based on the current authentication status. So let's take a look at our event listener. And here we have that it's just getting the current authentication status of the user, calls the login or logout method, and then let's look at to see what these login and logout methods actually have. So these have a login with direct and a logout method of the Auth0 client. That's pretty straightforward here. And then we have the handle redirect callback and the update UI. So let's take a look at the update UI. It's just displaying the correct text on the login button based on the current authentication status. And the handle redirect callback is managing the response coming from the Auth0 server after authentication. Right, so we're basically done. As you can see, we did a very simple process. It's just a login button that we have that has two attributes, the domain and client ID. These you will find in your Auth0 dashboard on your application, so you can add those there. If you want to take a closer look into my code, feel free to. It's on github.com/anasidri/login button. I'm constantly working on it, so there might be changes when you go check it out. And I know that a friend of mine is also helping out and sending in some PRs. So if you have any suggestions, please feel free to do so too. So let's take a look at our login button. So our login button is this, and it's then going to take you to this login screen. So let's see if that works. Going to our code, this is basically the same as we just saw, but instead of being on slides, it's in an IDE. I did an npm start, and then this is what it'll take you to. You click on the login. You continue with Google in this case. I choose my Auth0 account, and there we go. And we get the update UI working nicely. Cool. So this all works pretty nicely. And remember how I said that I had actually built that with vanilla JavaScript, Well, there are other frameworks and libraries that we can actually use to create web components. So let's just take a quick look at these because I'm running a bit out of time. So we have the lit element library, which is my favorite. But then there's Skate.js, there's Hybrid.js, Slim, Stencil, Angular Elements, and so forth. Now, it all depends on what you like. You can test out different ones. They're all very special, and there's been a lot of work put into each and every one of them. So that's pretty cool, in that we don't have to build everything with just vanilla.js. So one thing that tends to worry us developers is the browser. And I know that years ago when web components first came out, browsers weren't ready, which really put people off web components because they had to add loads of polyfills. Some of those polyfills weren't great. But I have news for you, and good news. The browser is fully stable, as you can see. And also, if we want to use older versions of the browsers, then we do have really good polyfills. So go ahead, browsers are not an excuse, go experiment. I'm very excited about web components because I can see they have a lot of potential, and I hope you're as excited as I am after my talk. So just before I go on to questions, I just want to thank you all for listening to me. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I have. It's been quite an experience. And feel free to all reach out now asking any questions, or on Twitter. There's my handle again. And thank you.
All right, so at this time, we've got just a couple minutes here. If you guys have any questions for Anna regarding her presentation, go ahead and enter those into the Q&A tab at this time. Or if you want to enter them into Slack as well, we can, we'll take a few moments here just to pass those on to Anna. And Anna, I guess you just did a really that good a job because I'm not seeing any questions right now. But
Yeah, they can always reach out to me on Twitter. Like I said, no need to rush into it.
okay,
I'm always available.
terrific. And are you going to be available in Slack for a little while afterwards?
Yeah, definitely. I'll be around until this evening. So
Okay. Well, terrific. So if you guys have any questions for Anna, be sure that you reach out to her, catch her in Slack, or use Twitter as she mentioned. And we'll let Anna go and take care of that. And we will be on with our next speaker in just a few moments.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Bye.
Bye-bye.